I've got the chat open right now if you'd like to say hello, but once Doug gets started, we will probably turn off the chat just so it's not too distracting. There will be a Q&A section at the end, and you can use that Q&A button on Zoom in order to ask any questions. If you're calling in, when it gets to that time where we ask for questions, if you want to ask a question, I believe you can enter *9, and I'll repeat this later. And that'll allow you to raise your hand, and then I can, give you that permission to actually talk. And then I believe we're also streaming to Facebook Live, and we are recording this, so we'll be able to share it. It'll be on our library's YouTube and Facebook. So, if anybody missed it, they'll be able to join later. Okay. So those are some of the fun housekeeping things. Okay, and I also want to thank our grantors and partners. So for those who don't know, we were able to get a small grant to be part of a nationwide initiative with HHMI, Tangled Bank Studios. And so they are promoting their documentary, My Garden of 1,000 Bees. And so with this, they were able to provide some funds for programming. They also gave us local wildflower seeds for pollinators and some other support and resources. So we've been running a whole lot of different programs. We're pretty much out of the wildflower seeds. We had gotten 1,500 packets and they're gone. So hooray, hopefully that means that a lot of native plants are going to be planted and supporting pollinators. And then I wanted to thank some of our partners we've been working with: Transition Berkeley, Pollinator Posse, Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour, the Museum of Children's Art. And we've been working and doing events at parks and gardens. Peralta Community Garden has been working with us. We'll be having events at Urban Audubon and the UC Giltracts Farm too. So we're really excited about all that. And then I do also want to acknowledge that as we're talking about these subjects and as we're having these events, that we are on unceded Ohlone territory. I definitely recommend checking out the Secotete Land Trust for more information on local actions. One of our events was actually at the Ashby Community Farm, which was recently rematriated to the Land Trust, which is really awesome. And that's also coming out with a new name as well. And quickly sharing, we're going to be doing a documentary screening and seed bomb craft at Urban Audubon on Sunday, July 10th. And we're going to have an education station, or many education stations, at the Giltracts Community Farm on July 12th for the kiddos. And that's going to be with Pollinator Posse. So we're really excited about those. And then another one, I don't have info up here, but we are going to be doing a kids session and an adult session at Peralta Community Garden on the 21st with Kelsey here, who's actually going to make some really gorgeous paper crafts, and we'll also have a no-pick scavenger hunt. And I will put some links in the chat in a little bit here so that you can find more info on that. All right, and again, for the phone-in listeners, you're all on mute, but later on I'll have instructions if you did want to ask a question. All right, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Kelsey.
All right, thank you so much, Elaine. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. The Berkeley Public Library is just so delighted to be working with Doug Tallamy today and to be participating in the Pollinators Grant. So a little bit about Doug. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 106 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 41 years. Just so much. You've done so much, Doug. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was published by the Timber Press in 2007. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Darke, was published in 2014. Nature's Best Hope a New York Times bestseller, was released in February 2020, and his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, was released by Timber Press in March 2021. In 2021, he co-founded the Homegrown National Park with Michelle Afendari, and he has also won numerous awards, recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon recognition, the National Wildlife Federation, and several more. If you enjoy this presentation today, you can find other talks Doug has given. He's given many talks on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts from. It's absolutely great to listen to these talks, and Doug's done a lot of work. So thank you so much, Doug, and please tell us more about Nature's Best Hope.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. It's great. Thanks for joining me. I guess we're all kicking off the 4th of July weekend. I guess this is a good way to do it, talking about Nature's Best Hope. Before I tell you about my idea of Nature's Best Hope, I want to talk about E.O. Wilson's idea of Nature's Best Hope. E.O. Wilson, of course, died the day after Christmas this year, and terrible loss to the world of conservation, to the world of science. But he had a very long and productive, extremely productive scientific career. One of the things that was consistent throughout his life was his love of biodiversity and his efforts to save it. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And it really was the culmination of all that thinking. And he said, in order to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book explaining the science behind that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us about how we were actually going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to conservation biologists, putting aside half the Earth for nature sounds like a great idea. Let's just do it. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our roads and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So the real question is, how can we possibly do this? Well, that's what I want to talk about tonight. I think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that new approach, let's talk about an oak mass that occurred in 2019 here on the East Coast. Now, you folks in California have oak mass all the time as well. It's where all the members of a particular oak group get together and decide to make their acorns at the same time. This is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally, it plopped down, and that's a dangerous time for this insect because it's good to eat. Everything's after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds and down it goes. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And surprisingly, that pupa stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they come out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. They've got to find a new home. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn. It takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live until this acorn falls apart 2 years later. So what's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions mostly between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays all over the country, actually jays all over the world, and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree. And then they tap that acorn beneath the soil surface. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and find that acorn and have something to eat. Well, the problem is for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. That's a problem for the jay, but it's great for the oaks because for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 new oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have the beloved Emarginia, that beautiful moth right there, unless you have mistletoe. That mistletoe that is up in your oak trees, that is the only plant that beautiful moth eats. You won't have 60 species of native California bees unless you have California sunflowers. That is the only pollen that they can rear their young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. Nature really is a series of these very specialized relationships. The problem is that these relationships and nature itself is now on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those typically are mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other countries, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature we need them to sustain to run the ecosystems that support us. So why have we done this? I don't know why we've done this. I believe that we thought that the earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds, 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. And now the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And so it said that 2 years ago, so I guess it's the next 18 years now. Makes an interesting headline, but it is not an option, folks. These are the species that keep us alive on planet Earth. We have to make sure they do not disappear. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, those food webs would all collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot. because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, and that is that doesn't have to happen. None of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are totally dependent on nature. We're products of nature. We're totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide us. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we need, like oxygen. They produce oxygen. They clean water after it rains, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. They capture carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere, pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Enormously important ecosystem service these days. Then they're locking up that carbon in their tissues. And even more important, they're pumping the extra carbon that they harness through photosynthesis into the ground for long-term storage. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put there over the eons. And once it's in the ground, it's stable for many thousands of years. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, they convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be difficult. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but really important. They provide pest control services for those plants. They pollinate nearly 90% of the flowering plants that are out there. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is really not a good option. You know, it never was a good option, but today it's a terrible option, because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before. And we need more today because of that 8 billion people that's on the planet. We want to support humans here without eliminating everything else, because of course we need everything else. Now, we do have parks and we have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but it's obviously not good enough because the Earth is now in its 6th great extinction event that has ever occurred on the planet. So we now need to practice conservation, not only in the parks and preserves, but outside the parks and preserves, on landscapes just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area. Then we go to another area, do the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was creating a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. Unfortunately, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this afternoon is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. Most of the land, at least this country, most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. Actually, California has the least amount of private property, but it's still 52% of the state privately owned. So if we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve whatever pieces of nature are left, but I'm talking about putting it back together again. A lot of people call that restoration ecology, restoration biology. But then other people say, well, you're never going to restore it to exactly what it was. And I know that, I agree. So let's use the word transformation. We're going to transform it from an unproductive ecosystem to a productive one. And we can do that by reuniting the specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature. It won't be exactly what was in that place beforehand, but it will still be a functioning ecosystem. Now, in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks of an ecosystem. Not all species contribute equally to ecosystem function. So we have to start with the most important ones. And there's two groups we cannot do without. One of them is the flowering plants. And then, of course, those pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and converting it through photosynthesis into food. And that is the food that drives all of animal life on terrestrial Earth. And they store that food in their plant parts, mostly their leaves. But we have to get the energy from plant leaves to animals, or we don't have the animals, and then we don't have functioning ecosystems. Most vertebrates, it turns out, do not eat plants directly. What they eat is invertebrates that ate the plants, and that turns out to be mostly insects. And not just any old insects. It turns out that caterpillars are enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to animals. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Let me give you an example from Carolina chickadee. That's a chickadee that we have here in Southeast Pennsylvania, where I live. You've got chickadees in California as well. They're all very similar, doing pretty much the same things. And one of the things they do is they come to our feeders, our bird feeders during the wintertime, and they eat seed. So we tend to think that's all they need. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seed. But the other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when they go to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. And they were going to send those pictures to her, to Ashley. She was going to identify all of the prey items that were in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diets for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And it was very successful. She got thousands of pictures. You're looking at a summary of her results for the 20 most common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets in each family that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't produce enough caterpillars? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So it sounds like something special about caterpillars. What might that be? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. And one of them is that they're soft. They're soft prey items. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton, its cuticle. It's made of chitin, which is undigestible. So the birds don't want a lot of that. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, very low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. And birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are an essential component of vertebrate diets. Where the birds getting their carotenoids from what they're eating, of course, and while they're rearing young, it's prey items, it's arthropods. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves, and that's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and a number of others are showing that caterpillars really are not optional parts of bird diets. For most birds, they're essential parts of the diet. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? Well, one or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one nest of Carolina chickadee to the point where they leave the nest, when they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody can count those caterpillars. And that means you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to create a nest of a bird that is a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you need all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. And that's true for most of our birds. They're foraging very close to the nest. And if we design landscapes that do not produce all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major components of bird declines that we're measuring out there. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that says we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches don't need to feed their babies insects. They can feed their babies seeds. They make a milk out of the seed, and it's okay for the babies. And look, they didn't lose any individuals at all over the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So we need to up our performance on our local landscapes. In the past, we've had one goal when we design landscapes, and that is to make them pretty. We now need to make them pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And in order to do that, we've got to put the insects back, particularly the caterpillars. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? How do we put them back? Well, you do that by putting the plants that support those caterpillars back in the landscape. And that seems easy enough, but there is a catch. And that catch is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we've got to be fussy about which plants we put in our landscapes, or at least which plants we include in our landscapes. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. You can have all the eucalyptus and all of the Asian ornamentals that we typically landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization. It turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the particular plants with which they have the adaptations to get around the chemical defenses in plants. Remember, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they have loaded their tissues with chemicals that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. Those are secondary metabolic compounds, and they're in just about every plant that is out there. It's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. And they can only eat the plants that they have specialized adaptations, again, to circumvent those plant defenses. specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But that takes a long period of evolutionary history for all of those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant, which is why if you take milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with any other plant, whether it's native or not, you're going to lose your monarchs. It cannot start to eat those plants. So the monarch has two choices if you take away milkweed. It can go find milkweed someplace else, or it will starve to death. So there are three kinds of plants we need to consider. We're talking about what they do. There are plants that contribute energy to food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to food, that do not share the energy they've captured from the sun. And there are plants that actively detract energy from food webs. So a good example of a plant that contributes a lot of energy, actually the most energy in most places, would be one of our oaks. They are the best at passing on energy, best plant in the country. A good plant, or a good example of a plant that does not share its energy would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's not invasive, it just sits there. I always like to think of ginkgos as like a statue, but they're not contributing ecologically to your local food web. And then a good example of a plant that actively detracts energy from food webs would be actually any of the invasive plants that we brought to this country. In the east here, we've got, this is Bradford pear, a calorie pear. Highly invasive plant. So not only does it not produce its own, does not support caterpillars itself, but it then invades natural areas and displaces the native plants that do produce all the energy for our food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild food webs, if we're going to restore local ecosystems, we've got to choose the plants that contribute. If we rely on plants that don't contribute or actively detract, we're going to fail, of course. And I'm going to give you three examples of how well it works when we do choose contributors, starting with my house, our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. It was a piece of a farm that was broken up. We moved in the year 2000 into 10-acre lots, and it had been mowed for hay before we moved in. So there were very few plants there. And our goal was to restore the local food web, the local ecosystem. Well, in order to do that, you got to bring the caterpillars back. So I'll give you some examples of how that worked. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet to start to make a living at our house. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. This is what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, in order to have Canadian owlets, you've got to have their host plant, which is meadow rue. It's the only thing they will eat. And we didn't have any meadow rue. No meadow rue anywhere around us. This place was farmed heavily for 300 years. So all the meadow rue is gone. We got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them. And this was early on. I actually had very little faith that the Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it after I planted it for at least 2 months. Then I walked by for another reason, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. And now we have a good population of both meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to our property. The transformation, the restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. And we didn't have any Biden's aristosa. It's called ditch daisy. Well, I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds and planted them at home, and they grew very nicely. But it took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it finally did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the Hackberry Emperor. I wanted the Hackberry Emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be at our house. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry, I planted them. We had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did. And now we got a good population of both hackberries and the Hackberry Emperor. So now we've added 6 species to the property, and that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that support or that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Acidura flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth, and many others. Planted Virginia creeper. I hear that a lot of people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color, can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover, makes valuable nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. Migrating birds need berries with high fat. That's what these berries have. It's a great pollinator plant. It's got tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see the big cloud of native bees that's around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. So if it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best plant to support the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. One of the evening primrose moth, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we had no evening primrose, no Enethera on our property, so I planted that. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And you folks in California on evening primrose have the Pacific green sphinx moth, another beautiful, beautiful creature. And I planted a lot of oaks. Those are just examples of the plant lineages that I put on our property, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York. It's a big tree. A lot of people argue whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak contributes to your local food web, you can enjoy it immediately. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of the oaks on our property as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web that everything at our house depends on by bringing in the moths that make the caterpillars that support that food web. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-bested moth, the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red humped oak worm, the orange humped oak worm, the pink striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You don't have to wait decades or centuries for your oak to start to bring the life back to your property. This is what our property looks like today, taken from the same place I took that first picture. Got a little lawn here. We're very traditional, but we put a lot of plants back. Not all the plants, still working on it. But as our research showed that you really need to understand the caterpillar community in your food web. If you want to know how stable and productive it is, about 5 years ago, I decided to try to record all of the species of moths that are making a living now at our house. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. And we do that by taking a picture of them. And so far, I've taken a picture of 1,148 species of moths now at our house. Now, we do have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we're supporting 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these moth species are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see all the time. And that is the World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. So don't give up, please. Imagine if everybody put the plants back. We could turn headlines like this around. But I know what you think. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people have less land than that. Can it work in suburbia? That is a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. And when they moved in, their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle from Asia. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 75 species of native plants, put in a water feature, and then sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species so far, including 35 warbler species. That's an astounding number. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, she's right next to O'Hare Airport. She's got 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. Now it's a pretty 1/10 of an acre. Pam is a landscape designer that uses native plants, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, water feature, and then she sat back and started to count the birds in her yard. And she is up to 124 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. If you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Chicago, go to Pam's house. There it is. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of those is, at least across the country, we've got to reduce the area that we have in lawn. Now, I know Californians are doing this because you don't have the water to support it, but most people are not. We have more than 40 million acres of lawn nationwide. And that's a 2005 statistic, so you know it's bigger than that now, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And we do that because lawn is a status symbol. So the more you have, the higher status you have. We also need a lot of lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if we took that 40 million acres and cut it in half, replanting it? What if we took areas like this and started to put the plants back, like Dan Getman is doing? He sent me this picture from Missouri. So he's just getting going here. Well, that would give us 20 million acres for restoration right at home. So we could create a new national park. I'm calling it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? You get the opportunity to develop, either for the first time or rekindle, a personal relationship with the natural world. And you could do it at your own time, at your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or even all you have to do is look out the window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people are there with you. So you're really visiting a lot of other people. It's free. There is no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. If you're hearing a buzzing in the background, that's a gray tree frog that is outside my window. And one of the species that's come to our house. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential for developing that personal relationship, not mediated by somebody else. And it's really important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder. You know, Richard Louv. We're trying. We get 30 kids. We put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they walk around a natural area for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world right at home, they can get to know it right where they live. All they have to do is go outside. Alone, no parental supervision. They will come home again. Let them develop this friendship on their own terms. And this is particularly important, that they become friends with the earth, because they are the future stewards of the earth. And if they're not friends with it, if they don't understand their role as a steward, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe. who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of grass with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you crawl up towards the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of that lizard, you fall in love with that piece of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture a little bit later. She really does like those lizards. But I guarantee she's going to remember doing this in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of this experience. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinisty's Nature Play at Home, dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property. It's free. What you're doing is you're just locating where you live on the map and the amount of land that you're going to be a good steward of. If you actually have some lawn, you're reducing that area. How much area did you reduce? If you plant an oak tree, if you put an aster in a flower pot, anything you do, you record that area and your little piece of your county is going to light up. And the object is to get the message that everybody, not just tree huggers, everybody is responsible for good earth stewardship. Do you get that message to go viral? This is our attempt at social media to do that. We've got about 15,000 people on the map at this point, headed towards 150 million people. So we need to spread the message a little bit more. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that was lawn? Well, I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because those plants are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 86% of our native plants are not contributing all that much. They're contributing, but not all that much. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold up that house. They're the support system. They're essential. We cannot build ecological houses out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do in the past. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are. But there are a number of native species that don't contribute all that much. So the question really is, do we want to favor those contributors? The ones that are supporting the most bees, the most native bees, and the most caterpillars, or not? What's supporting more caterpillars than anything else in the country? It is one of the oaks, the genus Quercus. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. So how do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You got a couple of options here. Go to Calscape. California is very lucky because the California Native Plant Society has put together this tool called Calscape that has georeferenced the location of every single species of plant in California. You know exactly where it occurs, you know where you live, and you know what plants are appropriate for where you live. So here are some figures from California. Your native oaks are supporting 270 species of caterpillars, arroyo willows 211, and right down the list. So very handy. I wish every state had a Calscape, but only California has one. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. A lot of research showing that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects. So, to me, this is actually good news. It's good news because we have not just got to stop insect declines, we've got to reverse it. We've got to rebuild our insect populations. And if we can do that by just flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. Now, there's a lot of switches we've got to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. But I know what you're going to say. Oh, I can't turn the light out over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize, the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is the best choice, because yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. They're far less attracted to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our white bulbs with yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects and also millions of dollars if we used LEDs. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to design landscapes that allows the caterpillars that run those food webs to complete their development. Something we're just starting to think about. So here's an example from my county, Chester County. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. Now, a few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and lets it hang from one of the branches. Then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most of the species that use oaks and other trees don't do that. They finish growing as caterpillars, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's considered, I don't know what it's considered, ugly. So we get rid of it. And we mow and compact all the ground under our trees so that they're rock hard and the caterpillars can't get underground. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Now, this is what most people do. You have a tree in a yard. And I've got a new grad student who's going to start measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, in a layered landscape where you have a tree and maybe a native dogwood and then a azalea and ferns ground cover. This is soft landing. The caterpillar falls down. There's plenty of leaf litter there. It can spin its cocoon, or the soil is not compacted. It can easily get underneath the ground. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on it. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do in the East, you can do your spring ephemeral gardening around your trees, but any kind of ground cover around your trees. This is how you shrink your lawn. Every single tree you have in your yard, you put a big bed around it. They're all safe sites. So you've got Yerba Buena, great ground cover, lots of ground cover options that are great places for those caterpillars to complete their development. Another former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And one of the results that she found is that there is room for compromise in our plant choices, which is good news. She had one simple question. How do chickadee populations do in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants? Introduced non-native plants. So when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, there were nest boxes up in everybody's yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that information together in a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%. And we looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this level, you'll have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you have more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you have fewer babies, anything below this line here, which you get when you've got a lot of non-native woody plant biomass, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Right here is where those lines liberally interpreting this, where they intersect, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your non-native woody plant biomass, or 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Now, you can't have any invasive species because invasive species are ecological tumors. They just keep growing on and on and on and ecologically castrate the land around you. But a lot of our non-natives ornamentals are not invasive. Like that ginkgo we talked about. Remember Dan Getman here? He's putting all these native plants in his yard, reducing the lawn, but there is a ginkgo from China. What's it doing here? Well, it's there because his wife said, I really like ginkgos and I want you to put one in. So he did, but it's not an invasive plant. It's not spreading. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No, again, it's just like a statue. So remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants, the absence of those contributors. If we increase the percentage of those contributors, we can tolerate more non-natives. Can we use natives in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. She sent it to me maybe 2 years ago at this point. You don't get more formal than that. That was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbors this is not just a patch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's meeting the needs of a number of species of bees. Now it's not very big. Could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. And remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time we need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 12th of our crops. But I don't like that argument because a lot of people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need pollinators. You do need pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. So here's a great pollinator plant, California lilac, just buzzing, buzzing, buzzing. Your native asters. You've got a lot of options for really, really strong pollinator plants out there in California. This is a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here compared to the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it longer than most. They've got a cost-sharing program where the state helps homeowners pay for the conversion of some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, a very popular program. Similar program in Pennsylvania. Florida has there's an island off of Florida where they're paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way, in my opinion, this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your yard, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your yard. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive plants like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native species. And of course, the great lawn reduction programs in California. This is going up. You get $3 per square foot of every square foot of lawn that you remove. You folks in California just don't get enough rain to support grass. And if you want more information on all of these programs, memorize that. Okay. We have made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, in my opinion, and this first one's really important. We've started to think about nature as if it's optional. It's not that we don't like it. We like to visit it, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and they had this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. These are wonderful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. But again, that reinforces this idea that nature is there just for entertainment. It's much more important than that, folks. Nature is there so that we have future generations. We cannot live without it. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts just to areas where you don't have a lot of humans, we're going to fail because there aren't enough of those areas left. David Quammen has a superb analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 79 Persian rugs. That's 79 rug fragments, none of which are functional Persian rugs. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it implies that there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rug back together again, not just to make biological carters that allow plants and animals to move between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats where we've taken them away by putting the plants back, where we live, where we work, where we shop, where we play, where we farm. And when we do this, and we're starting to do it, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You were not born with those mindsets. You're taught them. We're very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. The Earth has huge problems these days, and a lot of people recognize that, but they feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can use Keystone Plants. One person can turn out their lights. One person can remove the invasive plants that are already on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can totally revitalize the ecological integrity of their property and enhance the local ecosystem rather than degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the Earth that you can manipulate. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. That's your responsibility. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park, help a preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They would love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was amazing and wonderful.
So many incredible takeaways. Let's see. All right. I don't see any questions on Facebook yet, but I'm sure we have a few on Zoom.
I've now made it also that people can send messages to everyone if they would like. Just make sure you select to everyone in that little chat box. If you help with a local organization, and I think many of our attendees do, feel free to highlight that as well in the chat for other people. And then I also wanted to quickly mention that if you're on the phone and you wanted to raise your hand to ask a question, I believe *9 will give us a little raise hand, and then I'll be able to let you know when you can ask your question.
And a couple of folks have asked about viewing this presentation again and sharing this presentation with their friends and family and so on. It will be getting uploaded to the Berkeley Public Library's YouTube page, and it is currently on the Berkeley Public Library's Facebook page. All right. And it looks like Tracy Lindo says she was too slow to get a picture of the California Keystone Plants, and was wondering if you could provide or go back to that slide or talk about that.
Well, this is the value of having it taped, and just go to CalScape, right? I mean, that's get used to using CalScape. It's a wonderful tool, and they're all there. Oaks #1.
Fun. Yeah, and homegrownnationalpark.org. Read Doug Tallamy's information firsthand. It's just an incredible website, and as a librarian, this website makes me so happy because it is filled with databases and resources and links. All right, let's take a look at the Q&A. One question: how do you convince people to help when there are so many demands on them already? I know a lot of people who are sympathetic to the cause, but are too overwhelmed or stressed out to be willing to take any action at all. Tomorrow's disaster always seems to take a backseat to today's.
Yeah, that certainly is an issue. Not only that, but we're really talking about a form of gardening, and most people do not garden. Most people hire somebody to do that. So what I want is a new industry. We've got a giant gardening industry, a giant horticulture industry out there, but I want what I call ecological gardeners or ecological landscapers to really proliferate, so that you can open well, we don't have yellow pages anymore, but you just hire somebody. And it's not just a mow, blow, and go lawn care company. It's a company that will know how to put the right plants in your yard, know how to take care of them, and you won't have to do anything. You do just what you do now. Just hire somebody. That's the easiest solution to this. But we need to raise the priority here. We are doing a lot of things every single day, but this is really important, folks. The downside is that we humans are terrible at looking at long-term consequences. If it's not going to bite us this afternoon, we tend to ignore it. But we've got to get better at that, because it's going to bite us. And there's a lot of places all around the world where it's biting us right now. So up it in priority. Make small goals. Put in one plant, one tree this year. Do that every year. In 20 years, you've added 20 important plants to your yard. You can do that. You can find the time to do that.
Evelyn asks, what are insects that would be attracted to alfalfa, cattails, and clover pastures? Just a specific question.
Well, clover pastures are wonderful for generalist bees. So, things like honeybee, we need honeybee for a lot of our agriculture. That's the primary bee addressing our agricultural needs. And they need forage all year long, really. So things like clover pastures really help them. They help our bumblebees as well. Some of our native bees can use them, but the specialists typically cannot. I missed the first thing.
Alfalfa, cattails.
Yeah, these are ag plants, and they're there to help agriculture. They're there to feed our cattle and other things. So they're not going to be the primary leaders in biodiversity restoration. So this is why we want to take care of the land that we're not using for agriculture. We've got 135 million acres of residential landscapes in this country. No agriculture there that we're depending on. That's a lot of space we can do good things with.
Cindy says, in high fire areas in California, we are encouraged and inspected not to have leaf litter due to the particles being blown in the wind. What is the answer to this?
Yeah, that is in direct conflict with what the ground wants, and I appreciate that. You got terrible fire issues. The answer to that is living mulch So living plants, the more herbaceous plants, but in the really dry areas, of course, they wither and turn brown, even if they get green when it's rainy. So life is full of trade-offs, and that's probably one of them. You know, a lot of people say, well, I don't want any plants near my house at all, but I will recommend the live oaks that you have because they actually intercept blowing embers, and it's a good buffer against fire. So rather than say, I'm going to cut down my oak trees because they're fire hazard, they're the opposite. But the litter is an issue. I don't have a good answer to that.
All right. Florence asks, what are the worst invasive species in the Bay Area? If you know.
Probably when you get outside of the, I don't live there. I'm not an expert on your invasive species, but I know you've got a number of highly invasive African grasses that were brought in for cattle that are all over the hills. Cheatgrass through much of the West is a terrible invasive because not only is it an alien grass, but that is what catches fire first, and then that runs into the forests. So many of our huge forest fires are started in cheatgrass and then run into the forest. You never hear about that. So that's certainly a really important one. I don't know if you have Himalayan blackberry down there in San Francisco. As you go farther north, certainly in Oregon, and all the way up the coast, it's a terrible invasive. But now you've exhausted my Californian knowledge. So, you use an awful lot of plants from the east. They're not invasive, but they're also not supporting anything. So many of the trees that I have in my yard, they're common in the San Francisco area because they grow there. But and they're not invasive, but again, they're not the native ones that are supporting a lot. So it's not just invasive plants, it's your plant choice. Those plants that are sitting right in your yard, they're the ones that are going to make a difference, and you want them to be the contributors.
We just have such a great selection of links and resources in the chat right now. Elaine, thank you for encouraging people to post that. Groups with large members that are handing out seeds. There's so much here.
Yes, and somebody did ask about having it so that people can save the chat, which it looks like maybe that had been disabled. So we'll see what we can do about that, or at the very least we can get it onto our website. And then I wanted to mention there was one question saying, oak trees can get really big. Are there species that don't grow so tall?
Oh, there are, and you have them right in California. The Palmer oak is actually a ground cover. It's also the oldest oak. There's one that's been recorded at 14,000 years old because it just kind of creeps along the ground. So there are a number of species of oaks that are small. The problem is many of them are not in the trade. We've got to get them in the trade because they're good landscape plants. They just haven't been, they're not particularly showy, but a ground cover doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be 1 inch tall. Any shrub, all your ceanothus bushes, they're great biodiversity plants, and they're ground covers. So we want to get more of them into the trade as well. But there are small oak options.
And I think there was a clarification question they were asking, was the ground cover oak called the Palmer oak?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Chelsea, you're on mute if you're talking.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So we have a question about the fear of insects. Many people want to keep insects away from their home and think of them as pests. Do you think the inherent fear of insects are a barrier towards natural home ecology?
Yeah, they are. The fear of nature is a terrible barrier. And we get that fear, we extrapolate. We've got insects that bite us and insects that are ag pests. So we extrapolate that to all 3 million species, which is ridiculous. You are not born with a fear of insects. You're taught it by your parents, particularly your mother. When your mother screams when she sees something, and you're a 1-year-old, you remember that you internalize that. So you can do your own kids a favor by not acting fearful in front of anything in the natural world. It's not helping them. But it's a barrier. We've got a good friend who is just terrified of anything that moves, and boy, it restricts everything she does. So, yep, it's a barrier, and not sure how to get around it. But you have to start young, I'm afraid.
Yes, I've joked a few times that I was probably the worst person for this grant because I've have quite a fear of many insects. They're not in my loves. But it has been really cool actually getting to learn so much about how vital they are, and seeing like these cute fuzzy bees in pollinator gardens.
I can comment on that more, because when I was little, I had a friend that used to throw spiders at me. And that gave me a fear of spiders. I did not like spiders. I still don't like spiders. I do not pick them up, but it's easy to learn to tolerate them. I don't kill them. You just, ignore them, or you can get your little spider removal kit, which is a glass jar, and put them outside. So I understand a phobia that makes no sense. You can live with it. You just learn to live with it. You have to understand what's the benefit of this. I mean, in most of the country, people will kill all the spiders they see and then hire Mosquito Joe to spray everything and kill all the mosquitoes that the spider would have gotten. And it kills everything else too. So we have to be rational about our actions.
All right, and then someone was wondering about if moist leaf litter will still produce a good ecosystem for caterpillars.
Yeah, it's the best. The soil community is vital to everything that's growing above the soil. There are more species that live in the soil than above the soil, and they all depend on moisture. So when it gets really hot and dry, they go as deep as they can. If we can keep the soil moist, you're helping everything that's in the soil. There's one caveat that you don't want for plants that are adapted to dryness. If you water them all the time, you will kill them. So you don't want to do that. But moist, I guess they're saying if you spray your leaf litter and keep it moist, it won't be very flammable, and that's true. But you want to be careful about that. Creating a fungal issue by keeping it wet where it's supposed to be dry.
Okay, and then another question: is time running out to restore and rewild?
When something's extinct, it's gone. So in that sense, yes, we are in the 6th great extinction event the world has ever experienced. We've already lost a lot of species, but there's a lot of species left. The good thing about restoring insect populations is they're really resilient. Look at the monarch. We're working on rebuilding them. They were down to 3.6% of the eastern population compared to 1976, and it's come back pretty well. I think it's up around 10% at this point. You give them what they need. And in the case of monarch, it's milkweeds and blooming plants in the fall so they can migrate to Mexico. But if you provide what they need, they rebound pretty quickly. And when they rebound, then you've restored the food that all our birds need. And that's why I tell you that statistic about, 1,148 species of moths at my house. They weren't here when we moved in. We put the plants back. They've come. They're making a living, and it just wasn't that hard. So you really can put it back together again. Not when they're extinct. That's not going to bring them back.
That segues to our next question. Can you explain how you went about inventorying inventorying wildlife around your house?
Yeah, photographically. If I don't have a picture of it, I can't count it. So how do I get all these moths? I do a lot of we call them light trapping. It's not really trapping. You put out a light with a sheet and they come and sit on it and I take their pictures. But if I find them any other place, I take their picture. That's pretty much it. It's a photographic record, because then I can go back to it and, I can work on getting the proper name. I am not doing DNA IDs, so this is not a scientific study, but those pictures will show you they're morphologically distinct.
See, Alice asks about capturing spiders. If you have any advice for freeing insects, once you put a glass jar over the spider, do you slide paper under the glass?
That works really well. Yeah.
Okay. Alice is worried about injuring their feet. So.
Yeah, they're pretty delicate. So, if you put the glass on there and shake it, the spider will fall down into it. And then we just keep shaking it so he doesn't crawl out, and then throw it outside.
There was one question in the chat I'm not sure if we covered in regards to vetch, saying most think vetch is invasive. Does it attract pollinators?
There's a lot of species of vetch, but typically you're talking about crown vetch. Yes, it's very invasive. And I know that varies around the country, certainly at our house where you get a lot of rain, highly invasive. We've got vetch in our property. I didn't plant it, came from the neighbors. It does not support that many pollinators. Yes, it blooms, but it's kind of self-pollinating. It's got that papilionaceous flower. So it's overrated as a pollinator plant. There are many better options.
Awesome. And we're just we're looking everywhere. There were some messages that were only sent to the hosts and panelists, and it's hard to copy them over. But I know somebody mentioned that locally Friends of Five Creeks is a wonderful group that's working to restore various sites in the East Bay. Weed Warriors is part of the group that goes out every Tuesday morning to pull invasive plant natives in creeks, the shoreline and East Bay parks. I know there's a number of things happening even with the East Bay. I think the municipal water district. And like we mentioned before, there's a ton in the chat. So what we will do, because it's not possible for us to change over that setting right now, we'll save the chat though. I'll get everything onto a document and you'll be able to access it from our website page on Plant Wildflowers. Hopefully that is good. And then we can link to it when we also post the recordings. We can make sure we link to them there. Yeah. Thank you to everybody also who is so knowledgeable and helpful in the chat.
I just saw a question about balancing keystone species with everything.
Yes.
I just saw part of the question, but
Yes, how do we balance keystone species that support a wild variety of variety of species as compared to one plant that support a large population of one or two species?
Yeah, that's the diversity versus quantity question. And it's a good question. It depends on how much property you have. You do need a minimum amount of the plant to support what you're trying to support. And again, I'll go back to the monarch as an example. If you plant one rammet of milkweed, it's not enough even for one larva that'll strip it. And particularly if it's the only one around, the female monarch will come and she'll make several eggs on it, which means it's none of them will survive. So in a situation like that, you really want a milkweed patch. And it's better to have a sufficient quantity of milkweed than to have a whole bunch of different flowers where you only have one each. That's true for pollinators too, that are going to a specialist plant, because it's very efficient for them to go to a number of plants without having to fly very far. If you only have one and then they've got to fly half a mile to find another one, that's harder on them. At the same token, if you've got a lot of space, the more species of plants that you have with a sufficient quantity, the more diversity you're going to have. There's no doubt about it.
Joe asks, what should we plant for native bumblebees?
Most native bumblebees are fairly generalized. So they're considered long-tongue bees. So things with deep corollas are perfect for bumblebees. They do like the various clovers, but anything penstemons, there's a lot of plants with deep corollas, and bumblebees that's what they're specialized on. It's a generalist that specializes on deep corollas. Bumblebees are also pretty clever. If they can't get to the nectar, they become nectar robbers. They'll chew out the bottom of the plant and suck it out from there, the bottom of the flower. So it's, you know, a lot of different blooming plants are good for bumblebees.
Okay, and I think I'm going to do this last one from the chat, and then I might have a question for you. So I've had many monarchs come by this year, but also a lot of wasps, and haven't seen any caterpillars. Any suggestions?
Well, do you have the milkweed for the caterpillar? You're only going to see the caterpillars on the milkweeds. You know, wasps are predators. They pick off those caterpillars and carry them back, chew them up, and feed them to their young. So, and we have some invasive wasps too, at least in the East. We've got Polistes that have been introduced from Europe, and they're murder on our caterpillars. So, you know, predators are normal. They're a natural part of the system. But of course, your monarch population is desperately close to extinction. So it might, you know, if you know that your wasps are picking off your monarchs, do what you have to do.
And then one question that I've been asking almost many of our partners that we're working with, the local organizations, and I know you touched on this already too, but you know, in an urban environment for renters who don't have access to green space, you know, what are the best ways to get involved? And also, how do we stop the overwhelm of like information from stopping us from like actually trying things?
Information overload. You know, there are a lot of people, 82% of us live in cities with access to very little land. So we're working on we're going to add it to the Homegrown National Park website, a list of good natives that can do well in pots that you can put on your balconies or right outside your door. Now, they're not going to produce a whole lot of caterpillars, but they can be very, very helpful for pollinators that are highly mobile. They can be helpful for the migrating monarchs to get nectar on their migration. So you say, well, my little pot on my little balcony is not going to do anything. And it's true, but there's a lot of balconies out there. So if we have millions of pots on millions of balconies, it will do a lot. It'll start to green up the city. This is the concept in Singapore. If anybody's been there, it's not a big space, but it is really green. There are plants everywhere. We can do that a whole lot better in this country.
Alice asks, which type of milkweed is best?
Which part of the milkweed?
Which species of milkweed?
Which species are best for the monarch you're probably talking about? Yeah. Monarchs like, it's a good question. Monarchs like tender leaves. They don't care what species it is, but older individual milkweed plants start to get tough. So in the East here, a great way to have tender milkweed leaves for monarchs in August, when they're doing most of their reproduction, is to cut back your milkweeds right now in June, cut them back to the ground, and then they grow up again and they're nice and tender in August. I don't know what your phenology is in California there, but it probably works similarly. And this, of course, is what tempts people to use Asclepias curasabica, which is the tropical milkweed. It's beautiful and it always has tender leaves and the monarchs love it. The problem with that is it accumulates a disease that's hammering the monarchs. We just call it OE. It's a protozoan. And when you allow tropical milkweeds, don't die back. Let's put it that way. So the what are they, spores? The cysts, whatever they are of OE, accumulate on the plant. And I know down south, you can get up to 90% of the monarchs that visit these plants get infected. So I'm not sure what the situation is in California, but it's best to go with the native milkweeds as opposed to the tropical one. But so they seem to discriminate, but they're really looking for tender leaves as opposed to a particular species.
Yes, and I know Cowscape was mentioned a few times already, so for sure check out Cowscape and look there for some guidance on what is native. And again, thank you to everyone in our chat. We're at time, so I think I just want to thank Doug so much. Any last words or anything to uplift you want to uplift before you go?
Uplift. It gives you a really important a goal. You got to save the earth. You are nature's best hope. But it's a fun goal. It's really rewarding. And you just pick at it. Just do a little bit here, a little bit there. It'll make a tremendous amount of difference. So good luck.
Super inspiring talk. So many
Great.
takeaways.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. And thanks again to our experts in the chat as well. And I know a lot of them are also doing a lot for locally. So it's really great to be surrounded by these resources and organizations and experts, and just knowing that we're doing what we can. All right.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Doug. And thanks everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.